So we're privileged to meet today with Dr. Duncan Brown, a distinguished author, consultant, lecturer, and researcher. And we're looking back at a book that has made a massive impact. This year marks the quarter of a century since Paying for Contribution was published, co-written with another distinguished author, Michael Armstrong, at 96 now. But Duncan, thank you for your time. I wanted to start by going right back, ask you to cast your mind back. I'm looking, there's a smashing quote here early on. I was going to ask you about the rationale for the book, but you kind of spelled it out, but perhaps we could flesh that out a bit more. It says here, the problems with hierarchical and service-based pay systems, as well as the necessity of being continually more competitive in global markets and ever more cost-efficient in the public sector, helps to illustrate why there has been no significant move away from individual performance pay. Or perhaps less positively, as Helen Merlis put it at a recent IQPC conference, it may not be working very well, but what's the alternative? Do you want to talk a bit about what was your rationale? So I think that quote is very pithy, but I'm sure you can expand upon it a little bit for us.
Thanks very much for inviting me to chat around it. And I must admit, yeah, twigging it's 25 years ago kind of makes you feel old. And I was writing a review of some of the developments of the last 25 years for something else. And I thought there were lots of positive, actually, but the two negatives were, one, my girls now in their 20s are still facing 15-20% gender pay gap, having worked on that for best part of 40 years. But the other one was, that in a way, when you look at pay for contribution and what we were saying in there, some of what we called looks now pretty good foresight, but individual performance-related pay is still pretty much alive and well, and collective rewards still, whether you look at profit sharing or all employee share plans, are much less popular than they should be based on the evidence. So, I was pleasantly surprised with how much of it is still relevant.
Well, I think that's the point. It certainly has aged very well. It actually does make you wonder sometimes.
Better than me.
Is there anything new in reward management? But just going through, if I look at your central thesis, you built up competence and performance, skills and behaviors, something you called next level reward management, supposedly taking reward management to the next level, suggesting a more nuanced and sophisticated strategy than traditional PRP. And then to be future oriented, there you were at the dawn of the new millennium, real performance related pay strategies for the next millennium suggest you are presenting what you considered forward thinking approaches. So you've already commented about some of the issues still in play. Do you think that was the right central thesis? If so, can we start to look perhaps at some of the issues in putting it into practice?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's an excellent summary, Steve, and just highlights as well how we probably cribbed a lot of it from Ed Lawler in the US. Where particularly in New Pay, the kind of mid-90s book, where strategic pay kind of really set out the agenda that probably many of us followed to get pay away from just being a technical copy, what everyone else does, and a history lesson, into a more forward-thinking strategic discipline and profession, really. In New Pay, he really gave a clearer opinion, really, what his view was, which was moving from job-based to much more skill-based approaches, and also towards more variable pay reflecting performance. And I think in a way to say, we were saying how bad individual performance pay was. more the practice, I think, than necessarily the concept. And even if I might say, well, it's still, we see it now, I'm sure you do, that as, the productivity and the economy still stays pretty much in the doldrums. It's just a kind of deceptively easy lever that a new chief exec coming in is going to say, why don't we pull individual performance related pay? And that's kind of disappointing, particularly if the HR function and leader goes along with it. But on the other hand, I think what was, you will remember, such a hotly debated area about linking competencies and pay at all, which actually Ed Lawler himself, don't you, whether you remember Compensation and Benefits Review, had sort of two articles. I think one was by Hofrichter supporting competency related pay, and the other one was Ed Lawler saying, it's just not robust enough to link pay to it. And there were all the debates over even how do you spell competencies, but it was, wasn't it? We laugh now, but goodness me, it was really heated. And yeah, I think that's kind of gone. And yet, if I look at what most people are doing and the CIPD reward management survey, most people would say they're doing a mixed approach to how they adjust base pay, and that's got skills and competencies in there somewhere, whether it's in the performance management process or in progression in the lower part of the pay range. So I think it has got, I think skills and competencies, which was the key bit we were saying, was that in the book, was rather than look at 5 SMART objectives and link pay increases purely to that. For a lot of jobs, that doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're a physiotherapist, you can say 6 consultations is better than 3, but 12 is probably worse. You've got to look at, what their patients are thinking, the quality of the care, the outcomes of the care. And it was that sort of argument in a professionalizing, white collarizing move to society, moving more towards knowledge and service economy, where of course we are, whatever it is now, 2/3 of GDP. That, I think that argument has gone. It's been won, and now I think a lot of individual performance related pay systems that I see are better and do reflect some of the things we were saying in that book about address the performance management issues first, don't lead on pay, take a broad view of performance, not just 5 MBO objectives. Those are the areas I think probably the influence of people like you and me banging away with the research evidence, we could probably say, do you know what, we've made some progress.
Well, I'd like to think so, absolutely. I think it's good looking back to what Ed Lawler was saying at the time, of course, emphasizing you can measure skills, but competencies and capabilities, and as you say, all the various words, it's far more difficult. And I guess one of the things that remains salient, as you've just articulated it, is this idea of subjectivity when it comes to people having to make a management judgment at the front line. You need to be looking at, yes, what people do, what outcomes occur, but also how they do it, and do they do it in a way that's helpful to the team that they work with rather than harmful. We've seen instances where people, I don't know, there was one story I recall about traders where a female member of the team had to go off and deal with an emergency, and her colleagues left her computer. She just forgot about her computer was running, left it running, and suddenly millions of dollars are going down the Swanee, simply because people are only focused on their own side. So again, I think coming back to that, but what about the idea of being able to take the concept of paying for contribution into different settings? That was one of the other issues, I guess, that people think about implementation. Different industries, different stages of organisation development, obviously different countries. Have you had any feedback over the years from how people have managed to take the core theme and translate it from one setting to another?
Well, funny enough, I think, and it always makes me think of you that you know, having with you being so heavily involved in privatization of the energy sector, and then actually having that responsibility in national power, and you know, the smart and excellent reward directors and HR directors recognised straight away the need to take account of where you were coming from, in rather than just moving straight to kind of private sector performance related pay style approaches and putting the effort into performance management. Whatever you had a 2-year moratorium or something to build those processes and systems before you moved into it. But I think probably the area where we saw that least applied was the public sector, where the pickup of, I guess from Thatcher onwards, but certainly mid to late 1990s, to put individual performance related pay in the public sector, really in some places was pretty disastrous. And I remember my recently a dear colleague, Steve Bevan, who was deceased recently, unfortunately, doing a great paper in 1990-91 on, ironically, HMRC, and just these managers, senior managers coming out of meetings going, well, of course it's not going to work, and of course it didn't work. And I think you had examples of people getting the performance scales the wrong way round, so that high performers were given the lowest rating and this sort of stuff. But I think in the public sector, it is where it's, to answer your question, where I think the adoption of the skills and competency element, not funny enough, the variable pay element, which looking at the book was a bigger bit than I remember about the shift to variable pay, but certainly that skills competency element. And we were helped there really with the whole creation of the agenda for change architecture in the NHS, and the concept of the skills ladder within. I mean, it's remarkable now to think that, you know, you had an organization that big, couple of million employees, with no common pay structure at all. And so that was put in, and the sort of skills-based career model, but also then a progression approach that was a mix really of service and skills and knowledge. And the fact that their whole performance management approach wasn't called performance management, it was the KSF, the knowledge and skills framework, gave it that emphasis. And the other bit actually that I'd forgotten, just reading the case study in there, was ahead of its time, was rather than the kind of, I am going to assess you, Stephen, in terms of, yes, you've achieved these 3 objectives, not those 2. It was very much employee driven. You bring your portfolio. So the system, if you remember, was there were about 6 or 7 incremental points in each NHS pay band, and it was service based, which, as long as you're getting recruitment right, is fine in the early stages. And then you had these key gateway points, where essentially a viva to assess whether you were at the competence or skill level to progress to the next set of points. It was down to the employee to bring the evidence and their portfolio of their work, and get engaged in it. And of course, what they bought into that, and it's been very successful in terms of the majority of people vast majority getting through it, and we've seen it applied quite successfully, given there's not, the sort of disputes we have over the years on teachers' pay. It's been very successfully employed there in terms of the progression between the basic teacher scale and the higher scale. We've seen it for police. fire, a number of, the traditionally really difficult pay areas that in terms of individual performance pay, probably rightly, we're not going near it. You've got, some progression, but also evidence of some return for the taxpayer on that. So that's probably the area I think that yeah, I'd seen it most grow. The kind of radical end of it of heavily skills pay with and career-based pay progression, a couple of the pharmaceutical companies went into, of almost abandoning a position-based model in terms of a sort of person-based pay, which were very interesting, but probably always going to be too extreme to succeed in most employers. But I think that sort of middle combination is probably where most employers are and are working within. And it's the balance of those different criteria: performance, affordability, external market, and the kind of internal skills, competencies, fairness considerations. I think, that we're at a stage now that balance is shifting again, and the kind of knowledge, skills, determinants of contribution. Actually, it's probably a good time to re-emphasize some of these points.
Well, I agree. I mean, I can remember you a number of years ago making the point that every few years, however good your reward system, it needs a refresher, particularly the one that's thinking about people's contribution and how you're going to either incentivize or recognize it. I mean, that whole thing too, that's a debate that's never yet completed. Are we incentivizing or are we recognizing? Are we trying to look to the future or are we looking backwards? I was thinking about your 2001 book then that followed this up, Reward Strategies from Intent to Impact. It's very much about, you may have a strategic intent, but is it going to make a difference? You've just described a process which is really important if people are going to get the return on investment, the value for money that is promised. What I think I've heard in what you've just been saying is that one of the things with people implementing pay for contribution, reward for contribution, has been a lot of onus on the individuals to bring their story forward, but actually in so doing, almost to democratize the process. That it isn't just I'm the boss and I'm going to determine where you sit. You're going to have a conversation with me, and together we'll find what is an appropriate form of recognition. And so, on balance with all of that, A, getting the process more democratized, and secondly, is it more, do you think, about recognizing what people have done rather than trying to get into, the old Alfie Cohen world of if you're trying to motivate to incentivize people, don't be surprised if the results are disappointing.
No, and I think on both of those, I think the reward recognition again, I still think there's too much emphasis on incentivization in organizations, and that again is the kind of impact that profit sharing and those sort of schemes can have a massive impact. They're not you in most organizations, you're not going to get people coming running in on a Monday morning, so I'm going to drive up my profit share. But goodness me, their record is so good in terms of, I used to have a French client who called it whatever the French for glue was. That's a good glue, that we're all in this together, correlates with loyalty, levels of engagement, etc. All those sort of good things, recommendations to others as a driver of engagement and loyalty as a place to work. So I think that element, is probably a good one to re-emphasize. But the other, your first one around democratization, I mean, again, depending on the setting, the other bit, which again, whether from your pretty unique background of being sort of top academic and top practitioner, that your work's always so strong on, is the line manager piece. And again, I think we're at an interesting stage where just reading that book, rereading it, how far that kind of devolvement to the line, just how strong that was. Nobody in HR was resisting it. They were trying to make it more effective, but it was a very strong management and leadership philosophy then, wasn't it? Stronger than I remember. Whereas now I think it's really interesting that even if it is worries over pay transparency and equity and the threat of legal action that's doing it, I'm seeing quite a lot of organisations pulling back the pay decision making, controlling more for consistency and fairness, which again I think needs to be an appropriate balance. But I think probably quite a lot of particularly large organisations would probably say now that devolvement of pay management responsibilities went too far, and actually getting a more intermediate balance is probably a good thing.